Welcome back to the Wargamers Workshop. Now, I've painted an assortment of miniatures across the Age of Sigmar range, but I've got a confession. I've never actually painted a Stormcast Eternal. The old aesthetic it never really seemed to click for me. The golden armor, along with some of the older sculpts, just more times than not, ended up looking like a reanimated statue. The new Stormcast Eternals look amazing. The combination of using the Hallowed Knights painting scheme along with the darker aesthetic is a real game changer for me. Join me as we build and paint what is, I think, the coolest miniature in this box set, the Lord Terminos.
So this sprue contains the Lord Terminos, as well as the other Reclusians and their accompanying Memorians. Now it's a monopose kit, which means you're going to be building exactly what you see on the box. It's also a push-fit sprue, just like all of the others in the Skaven type box. This means it goes together reasonably easily, but if you want to avoid getting gaps, you're going to have to be pretty careful to shave down the pins a little bit and to make use of sprue goo. Now, in my opinion, I think this is really one of the best sprues in the set. I love the aesthetic of all of the minis on this sprue. But today we're really going to be focusing just on the Lord Terminos. The Lord Terminos wields the Blade Terminos, a great axe, and in addition to being an intimidating weapon, it can also be used to perform the last threshold rites on a Stormcast, effectively allowing them to terminate a Stormcast that has lost all of their humanity or wants a release from the endless reforgings. Now, the Lord Terminos is accompanied by Memorian, who is a mortal priest whose duty is to keep the Stormcast tied to humanity. These Stormcast have a darker, more worn aesthetic than normal Stormcast. In particular, the Lord Terminos with his giant great axe has an almost dark, sinister vibe. These are going to be a lot of fun to build and paint. So let's get these all assembled so we can begin painting them. Now that the miniature's all assembled, we can move on to painting it. We're going to start by using Vallejo's Mecha Grey Air Primer to prime the mini. After this, we use Night Scale through the airbrush to paint over all the metallic areas of the mini. We also use it for the head of the axe. We follow this up with some weapon bronze over the center of the head of the axe, trying to create a bit of a nice blend between the black and the bronze metals, and also over the flame areas. We then create a very small highlighted area on the head of the axe using gunmetal to just add some variation on that big sharp blade. Let's move on to painting with the brush. We start by coating all of the areas that we want to be gold on the mini using glittering loot, which is a metallic speed paint. For the Lord Terminos, this is going to be the shoulder pad, the hourglass, the armor behind the head, and the two Bessagays. Now, I had to look that name up, and I'm probably pronouncing it wrong. Apparently, they protect the armpit areas of a knight. Now, I'm not a fan of most metallic speed paints, but this one actually goes over quite well when used over other metallic paints, and looks really effective when combined with a wash. We'll then also follow up by painting the tips of the flame areas on the head of the axe with this glittering loot paint as well. After this, we move on to washing the armor, and now we're going to be using two key colors for the washes. We'll be using dark tone for the black areas initially, and once this dries, we can then go and use some strong skin shade for the gold areas. So let's start by using dark tone. Now, one thing that actually really trips me up when painting up this mini, and in particular using these Warpaint Fanatic washes, was that the Army Painter washes, they really need a good shake, and I didn't do that enough here. And so I ended up with this really glossy finish that looked not great. Make sure not to let it pull too much, and make sure you shake it up enough before you actually use them. While this is drying, we're going to move on to painting the cloth areas and some of the other details on the mini, of which there is no shortage. For the cloth areas, we're going to start by using matte black. Now, matte black is a bit of a weird Warpaints Fanatic paint where it's a lot thinner than a lot of the others and doesn't cover super well. So we definitely need a couple of coats here to get a nice black finish. Likewise, we then base coat the fur pelt areas with a couple of coats of Dryad Brown. We'll base coat the parchment on the back and also on the side areas of the Mini using skeleton bone. Now, once the dark tone has dried, we can move on to washing the gold areas using strong skin shade. Once again, taking care not to let too much of it pool. The strong skin shade creates a really nice warm gold color. We then lightly dry brush plate metal over all of the armor plates and over the axe head to give it just a quick highlight. We then use the same color with a brush to edge highlight some of the areas that we want a bit of a stronger edge on, like the plates on the legs and on the head area. We then come back to the areas that we had just previously given a base coat to give them a quick wash. So we're going to be using soft tone to wash the parchment areas and strong tone on the fur pelt. While we let these areas dry, we're going to be coating the inside of the cloak using worn stone, which is a nice off-white color. Once again, we're going to be using a couple of coats to get a nice solid finish. We also use this color to paint up the glass areas on the hourglass. After this, we're going to paint up the base coat on the leather of the hilt of the weapon using Brigadine Brown. And then we move on to, I think, what was my favorite part of painting up this Stormcast Eternal miniature, which was shading the cloak. This is an area where I really think it's worth investing that bit of time into, as it really elevates the finish of a mini. We're going to be using a combination of matte black and deep grey, which is a lovely dark grey with this very slight bluish hue. We mix these up a bit on the wet palette and then use some wet blending on the mini to create this nice transition between the bright and the dark recessed points on the cloak. So basically working between the two areas. We don't need any additives for this. The Warpaints Fanatic paints actually work quite nicely for this due to their decent drying time. We then use deep grey by itself as a thin edge highlight on the edges of the cloak as well as the bottom parts of the holes in the cloak, as these are the areas that the light would be hitting. Then we'll move on to tidying up the parchment areas, and we're going to be painting over areas where the wash pooled using skeleton bone, trying to tone down that gloss a little bit, and then edge highlight using bony spikes. We'll then also highlight some of the fur pelt using fur brown, and we don't need to pick out every individual strand, instead just pick out some. We'll then highlight just on the tips of this fur using buffed hide. Next up, we'll highlight the inside of the cloak using the same wet blending approach as we used on the back side of the cloak. Instead, this time we're going to be blending between matte white and worn stone. We'll then get started on the glowing area on the axe, and to do this we're going to load up the brush with a lot of water and use it to deposit matte white directly into the engravings on the axe's head. We then use the plasma glow effect paint over the engravings, as well as layering several thin glazes of it over the surrounding metal. After this, we'll start edge highlighting up and down the haft of the axe using fur brown. At this point, we're pretty much finished with painting the mini, so it's time to start painting up and decorating the base. We're going to start by using Castle Grey over all of the stones on the center rock. We also quickly use some matte black just to paint a black rim around the outside of the base. Now, I didn't manage to catch the next step on the camera, but in short, I used Vallejo mud on the base, building up a thick layer and using it to make the stones appear like part of the surrounding terrain. While it was wet, I also embedded some additional rocky texture in the form of battlefield brown from the army painter. Now, I had to leave this to dry for a little while, but once it dried, I painted over it using oak brown. And while it was still wet, I mixed in some tundra taupe, as well as some castle greys in different areas around the base to create some natural variation in the colours. I then also used some of the tundra taupe and oak brown paints on top of the stones to create the appearance of mossy stone. Afterwards, I used a combination of both strong tone on the ground area as well as dark tone on the stones. And I used them both while they were wet so they could mix together a little bit. After all of this had dried, I then attached some tufts from the Gamer's Grass Highland set.
The Lord Terminos was an absolute blast to build and to paint. It is such a cool sculpt, and despite the fact that it's push fit, it went together really well with minimal gaps. Though I kind of wish that I'd left the axe off. These push fit minis actually do lend themselves really well to being painted in sub-assemblies. And ultimately the axe really got in the way and made painting the front of the mini quite challenging. Now I'm really looking forward to building and to painting the rest of the Skaven Tide box set. And in particular, I really want to give the new Spearhead mode a go. Have any of you had a game of Spearhead yet? How did it go? I'd love to know how you found the new format. Now, don't forget to subscribe if you want to see more content like this in the future. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope to catch you in my next video.